So let's talk about another factor that causes a lot of disappointment on the spiritual path. In a way, you could say that this factor is the underlying cause of disappointment because it's kind of behind all of the other factors. In my last video, I talked about gurus. And in a sense, you could say that it isn't the gurus, it's the way you approach gurus and the way you approach the spiritual path in general. And so the factor I'll talk about in this video is a lack of balance or an unbalanced approach. The problem with this is that it's kind of hard to talk about, it's kind of hard to define exactly what do I mean with a lack of balance. So let's try and look at some examples that I have encountered both in myself and in other people I've observed on the path. So as an example, let's take my first spiritual movement that I found in 1976. It's a meditation movement. And the idea was that if we could get 1% of the world's population to meditate 20 minutes morning and evening, we could basically solve all the problems in the world. Meditation was literally presented as the one solution to all problems. And I'm not saying I wasn't swept up in this when I first came into the movement, but I actually didn't so much think it was meditation. I thought that if we could get all people to acknowledge that there's a spiritual path, then we could change the world. But in the movement, it was very much this: we have to get everybody to meditate our specific form of meditation. And in the several years that I was in the movement, people were very, very enthusiastic about this, and everybody was hoping that we can convert everybody to meditate, or at least 1% to meditate, and then we can change the world and have a major impact on society. And of course, underlying this was this hope that because we've done all these studies about the scientific effects of meditation, there will come a point where the scientific community and the politicians and governments will recognize the value of meditation, and everybody will be taught to meditate. They will teach children in meditation in schools and all of this stuff. And I've seen the same pattern in quite a number of other spiritual movements that also have this same hope that, number one, we have the teaching, we have the technique that can save the world, and number two, it's just a matter of time before the world realizes this, and number three, when the world realizes this, we will be acknowledged as the ones who were the pioneers because we saw it first. And I don't want to take away people's enthusiasm, but I've just seen over the years how this particular approach leads to disappointment sooner or later. I have met people who could be enthusiastic about their spiritual movement for a long time, maybe even decades, but eventually there just comes a point where you say, you know, I've been hanging in this hope for now 10, 20, 30 years that the world is going to wake up and recognize our spiritual movement. I just can't do it anymore. You know, and so when that happens, many people get really disappointed. They might feel they were fooled by the guru, and they might give up on the spiritual path, thinking that, oh, spiritual people will never have an impact on the world. And I think that's very unfortunate because, as I've talked about in other videos, I do think that spiritual people have already had a major impact on the world and can have more of an impact in the future. It's just that it's not going to happen by the world acknowledging one spiritual guru or one spiritual movement as the only one or the superior one. So if we have, so you see why I'm talking about unbalance. I'm not talking about a black and white, you know. I'm not saying that hoping that spiritual people can have an impact on the world is wrong and we should give it up completely. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that we need to find a balanced approach to this so that instead of thinking that our spiritual movement will be recognized by the world, we have a more universal approach in saying there is definitely something that spiritual people can do to change the world. Because as long as we think the world is going to recognize one spiritual movement, one spiritual guru, it's a false hope that we have, and it will lead to disappointment. And as I said, it can very well cause us to give up on the spiritual path in general and on the whole idea that spiritual people can have an impact. Now, I have another video in my series about how the world works where I talk about what spiritual people can do to change the world. But I don't want to go into that here because what I want to stay with is this lack of balance, the idea of an imbalanced approach. So it's not imbalanced to think that spiritual people can have a positive impact on the world. But it is imbalanced to think that the world is one day going to recognize one spiritual movement or one spiritual guru as the superior one. So if you can shift away from the specific to the more general and universal, then you can recognize that as spiritual people, we have already had an impact on the world and we will continue to do so. But the way we do it is to raise the collective consciousness. And that's not something we can very easily see specific results of. So another imbalanced approach to changing the world is that we think that there will be specific changes. In my second spiritual movement, for example, we gave all of these decree services where we would decree for 4 hours and sometimes even more. Hundreds of people would decree together, and we did it for changing specific world conditions. For example, for many years we gave decrees to end world communism. And, I'm not saying that this didn't have an impact because world communism, or at least the Soviet Union, did collapse. And I think many other spiritual people have made a contribution to raising the collective consciousness, and this has various impacts. It's just that if you are expecting that you see a one-to-one correspondence between what you are working towards as spiritual people and what's actually going to happen in the world, you set yourself up for disappointment because the world is changing. It's just not happening as fast as most spiritual people would like. And it's not necessarily either happening according to a specific vision that might be defined in a specific spiritual teaching. So again, I'm not saying we should give up all hope of changing the world. I'm just saying that the more specific we are in our attempts to change the world, the more we set ourselves up for disappointment. Okay, so now let's move on to some other examples from the more personal realm. One of the things I have seen both in myself and many other people is this hope that if we make an extraordinary effort for a time, we will have this major breakthrough or awakening. And I saw it in my first spiritual movement. I mentioned it before that many people were focused on taking these long meditation courses. There was a teacher training course, 4 months. There was a governor training course for 6 months. And some people would go from one to the other. And some people would be on these meditation courses for a year because they were hoping that this was going to give them the breakthrough that they would be in a higher state of consciousness. And what do you do when you go into this state of mind? Well, you're basically setting aside all the other aspects of your life. These were very expensive courses, so people had to take loans, or they had to work for a while just to do this. And obviously you couldn't have a family, you couldn't even have a job, you couldn't study. So you're setting aside everything else. You're sort of betting the farm that taking these meditation courses is really going to change you. And I'm not saying I didn't have some of that myself. When I took my first 4 months meditation course, I was hoping to get some kind of result out of it. And I actually got much more than I hoped for because, as I've said before, it kind of blew my mind and put me into this. It gave me so many non-dual experiences that I really had an identity crisis, didn't know who I was. And it made me depressed for 3 or 4 years. And I saw in myself also that when I found my second spiritual movement, it was headquarters in America. So my first wife and I, with our 2 children, sold our house, gave up everything in Denmark, and moved to the United States, to the headquarters of this movement, where we embarked on this program where we studied more loosely for a time, and then we went on a 4-month course again. And we obviously did this because we hoped that this would be some kind of a breakthrough for us. And I'm not saying that you can't get results from doing this, but I never really met anybody who had this major breakthrough as a result of doing it. And I think the reason is that it's an unbalanced approach. And the reason why it's unbalanced is that, I've talked about this before in different contexts, but it's like this, it's the outer path where you think that setting aside everything in your normal life and focusing on this spiritual pursuit, that is automatically going to produce results. That's automatically going to change your state of consciousness. And quite frankly, I can see it in myself, I saw it in many other people. It's like you're trying to strike a bargain, either with God or with some spiritual masters, however you see it. You're basically saying, if I demonstrate to you that I'm willing to forsake a worldly life, if I demonstrate that I'm willing to put in this effort and take these courses and practice this spiritual practice, you're going to give me results, aren't you? It's like a bargaining approach, See, God, I do this for you, then you do this for me. And you just can't bargain with God. It's that simple. You can't bargain with spiritual masters. Why? Because the ascended masters are true spiritual teachers. They want you to grow spiritually, but they also know something that most spiritual people don't know, and that is that the only way that you're going to grow is resolving your psychology. And that no spiritual master, not God himself, not the Buddha, not Jesus, not an ascended master, not this guru or that guru, can do it for you. As I've tried to explain in basically all of my videos, spiritual growth is a process. The attitude that I had myself when I was young, and I've seen many, many spiritual people have, is that we think somewhere in there, in our minds, not necessarily in our brains, but in our minds, there's this switch. And somehow, as you see in this old painting in the Michelangelo, where the hand of God is reaching down, touching the hand of Abraham, somehow the hand of God is going to reach down into your mind, flip that switch, and you're going to be enlightened, awakened in cosmic consciousness. And it's completely unbalanced. It's completely unrealistic. There is a switch. However, there isn't just one. There's many switches because, as I've explained, we have over many, many lifetimes on this planet, on this very, very difficult planet, we have created all of these subconscious selves. Each self is based on an illusion. In your mind, there is inside the self a switch. And if you flip that switch, you're going to see the illusion of that self. A spiritual teacher or teaching may help you, but can't flip the switch for you. You have to flip the switch. And that will give you a small breakthrough. Sometimes it can feel like a more dramatic breakthrough, but there are many other subconscious selves. So it's not just one switch you have to flip. It's a lot of switches that you have to keep flipping for a long time before you sort of switch in general. And what do I mean with that? Well, I mean that for the first, 20, 25 years, maybe a little more, that I was on the spiritual path, I had this what I call the deficit approach, I always felt I was behind. I wasn't doing enough. I should be doing more, because I was still struggling. I was still suffering. Felt like I wasn't in the right state of mind. And there came a point after this long time where there was a bigger shift that happened. And it wasn't a switch where I suddenly felt that I was enlightened or awakened. But it was that I switched away from the deficit approach, where I realized, oh, I'm not actually behind. I'm not deficient. There's nothing wrong with me. I actually came to accept there is nothing wrong with me, as I've talked about before. And so that was a big switch, but it didn't mean that I was done, that I had reached the ultimate level of the spiritual path. I realized I had more psychology. I had more little switches to flip. But what it actually did for me is that it brought me out of the unbalanced approach to spirituality that I had had before. Because what was it that caused my unbalanced approach? It was that I felt the deficit. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't there. So I had to do something extraordinary to get there. And that's what caused me to be unbalanced. And I was very unbalanced when I look back at it. It was in a sense, but I was unbalanced to leave my country and go to another country and focus all of my energy and attention on the spiritual growth. In a sense, I'm not saying I shouldn't have done it, because for a variety of reasons in my life plan, I needed to do this. But I'm just not saying it was an unbalanced approach. And so what I'm saying is that after all of this time, after making all of these smaller switches, I came to that point where I could accept. I accept myself. I accept my right to be at my present level of consciousness and strive to go higher. And then I didn't have to be so unbalanced. I could find a more balanced approach to the spiritual path. And I've seen many, many other people do the same thing. You have this deficit approach. I have one of my breakthrough videos where I talk about the compensation games. And basically, when you have this approach, you're turning the spiritual path into a big compensation game, where everything you do is an attempt to compensate for this lack you feel inside yourself. And quite frankly, the lack you feel inside yourself is a psychological condition. It's not a spiritual condition as such. It's a psychological condition, because you have one of these subconscious selves created a long time ago, probably as a result of being viciously attacked by the fallen beings, as I described in my series about avatar psychology. And it created this self that is constantly projecting at you, you're not good enough, you don't have a right to be here, you shouldn't really be here. So again, I'm not blaming anybody, because it's very understandable that we have these selves. There's a reason why they were created, and probably nobody could have avoided this given the situation we were in. So it's not a matter of blaming, but it is a matter of coming to the point, and for me it took a while, and hopefully it won't take as long for you, where I realized this. I realized that this was a psychological condition in me. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say with this. Before I saw this, I had the idea that it was a spiritual condition. And you can describe it in different ways. And I've seen it in different spiritual movements. They describe it in different ways. In my second spiritual movement, they talked a lot about spiritual light. And you had so much light in your aura. A certain amount of light. And it was a matter of invoking spiritual light from your ascended masters. You could get more and more light in your aura. And the idea was that once you had enough light in your aura, it would transmute your karma. You could especially invoke the violet flame. And I'm not saying this isn't valid, mind you. It's not what I'm saying. But the idea was that if you invoked enough violet flame, you would resolve your karma, and then you would have enough light, and that would compensate for the lack that you felt. Now, I remember when I just come to the United States and I was new in this American spiritual movement, there we were having kind of a discussion group for new people, and there was this girl who said that, yeah, they always say whenever you have something come up in your psychology, it always say, oh, put it in the violet flame. In other words, you should give some violet flame decrees for dissolving a condition. And she said, and I've done that, but it just keeps coming back. And, you know, why is the reason? Why does it keep coming back? Because you haven't resolved the underlying psychological condition. In other words, the separate self, the subconscious self that you have. And you can put this in the violet flame all you want. And it might do some good in the sense that it can transform the energy that is created through this subconscious self, making it easier for you to see it. But in the end, it isn't going to switch until you come to see the psychological condition. And that's why I'm saying, as I said in my last video, no spiritual guru can do this for you. An ascended master can't do this for you. God himself can't do it for you. So it's like, you know, I talked about I switched from the deficit approach to the positive approach. And what actually happened in that process was that I came to understand what I've been trying to explain basically in all of my videos, that spiritual growth is about resolving psychology. And I accepted that. I accepted that it was that I needed to look into my own psychology. I had already done this before, but I accepted that this is the central element of spiritual growth, is psychology. And it wouldn't happen by doing outer things, by doing spiritual practices. It would only happen by me looking at what my ego and the subconscious self don't want me to look at. And when I realized that, it was so liberating and so empowering, because what had I been doing up to that point? I'd been chasing something outside myself that was gonna do it for me. But it wasn't happening. And I had been doing all the right things, studying teachings, practicing practices, leaving my home country, doing all these extreme things, and it still wasn't happening. So I couldn't understand why it wasn't happening. But when I accepted that it wasn't happening because there was something in my psychology that I hadn't looked at and resolved, all of a sudden I was empowered. And I know this can be tricky to grasp because, you know, our egos will scream, don't look at me, don't look inside. There is a way where you can grow. Just find the right guru, the right spiritual technique. Then you can grow automatically without looking within. But it's all a lie. It's all an illusion. And when you get it, it's empowering, because now, what can stop you? What can stop you from looking inside yourself? Nothing outside of you can stop you. And it was never something outside that stopped you from looking inside yourself. It was only your own ego and these subconscious selves that make up the ego. And when you acknowledge that, bam, you are empowered. Nothing can stop you anymore. Nothing can stop your progress. But here's the key to this. I also realized at the time that this wasn't going to happen in one glorious breakthrough awakening experience. It was going to happen a little bit at a time. Flip one switch, flip the next switch, flip another switch. And you just keep going. And once in a while you flip a switch and there is what feels like a major breakthrough, because now you really see something you hadn't seen before. So it's not that there aren't bigger breakthroughs, but there's just never that glorious epiphany that some people want to make it out to be. And so this leads to a question then. What about all these gurus out there who claim they had an awakening experience? They were suddenly enlightened because now they saw this and their lives were never the same. Well, that's great, guys. I'm not doubting you had a traumatic experience. Okay? But I've had 50 or more of those kind of experiences. And the first couple of times I thought, am I enlightened now? Is this it? But then when you realize you have more and more and more, you realize, no, that wasn't it. So all I'm saying is, you can have a dramatic experience. Fine. Doesn't mean you have resolved all of your psychology. As I've said, the conscious you can at any time step outside of all these subconscious selves. You can have an experience of a higher state of consciousness, of a neutral state of consciousness, but you will come back from that experience, and it might change the way you look at life, but you still have the psychology that you haven't resolved. And if you think, now I'm enlightened or awakened, I don't need to look at my psychology anymore, then you're not going to go higher. You're going to stop right there. And I will also say that as you grow, as you have more and more of these experiences, there's less and less of a contrast between the experience and your normal state of consciousness, because you have raised your normal state of consciousness. So all of a sudden, going outside of the separate cells you have left is not such a dramatic experience, there's not so much contrast. So it actually, the higher you go on the path, the less of a contrast there is. And I would say that the higher stages of the path, the higher states of consciousness, it's not this dramatic breakthrough that changes everything. It's just very gradually happening. It's just sort of oh yeah, okay, something shifted. But it's not this big dramatic thing that many people want to make it out to be. Why do they want to make it out to be that way? Well, what did I say about spiritual gurus? You have to stand out from the crowd. You have to make some kind of claim that something extraordinary happened to you. And then you attract some followers. They want to believe that they can just flip that switch and be enlightened and go on. So you see what I'm trying to say here is that there are all these mechanisms on the spiritual path. And every movement, every teaching kind of has its own mechanism, because they define a goal that you're supposed to reach. And they defined a path for reaching it. Practice this practice, study these teachings, go to darshan with a guru, have him touch your third eye, whatever it may be in the specific movement. Meditate, meditate more. And that's not what does it. And if you think that these outer things can do it for you without you looking within, you are having an unbalanced approach to the spiritual path. And it will lead to disappointment, because the big glorious switch that you are looking for isn't very likely to happen. And I know you can point to all of these people and say, it happened to me, what are you talking about? You just haven't done the right thing. But did it, as I said? Was it really that they resolved all of their psychology in this glorious epiphany? Or was it one of two things? One, they had resolved a lot of psychology in past lifetimes, and so they just needed to make some final switch. Or two, that they had a dramatic experience, but they still have unresolved psychology left. I mean, you can look at gurus out there and you can see that there are some gurus that I would consider to be genuine gurus, but they still have certain human qualities. And could it be because they have some unresolved psychology, they have some subconscious selves? I'm not saying this is bad or evil. I'm not saying this disqualifies them for being spiritual teachers. I'm just saying, could it be that there is still something that isn't quite resolved? Again, nothing wrong with it. That's pretty much where we are all at. You show me the perfect human being. And I know, again, there are people who will say, our guru is or was the perfect human being. And what you will notice about many of the people who say this is they are victims of what I call the dead guru syndrome, which is there was a guru who started a movement and gave some teachings. Now he's no longer in embodiment. And after he left embodiment, his followers have built up this enormous idolatry around the dead guru. Why? Because now there's no danger that he's going to display some human quality that's going to shatter the image that he was the perfect human being. And so when the followers want to be special, what do? Oh, they build up the dead guru, because nobody can really contradict what they're saying. Nobody can really say, Well, I was there with the guru. I met him and he did this to me. Well, what are you going to say to that? He isn't around to prove it. He himself can't object to it. So I'm just saying, all of this is an unbalanced and imbalanced approach to the spiritual path. And it will lead to disappointment. So the question is simply, how long will it take for you before you have the breakdown and realize this isn't the right approach? And does it necessarily have to happen with this big disappointment? Well, that depends. Because see, what you see in many of these people, and I can recognize in myself, as I said, with the deficit approach that I had for at least 25 years, is that there's tension. There's a tension in you about the spiritual path. And why is there tension? Well, partly because of unresolved psychology, but also because your intuition is trying to tell you something, but your outer mind is denying it. So you're pushing down your intuition. Your intuition is pushing to come up from the subconscious mind. Hey, you need to look at this. And your conscious mind, these cells that you have, pushing it down. And so if it is in your life plan, as I've talked about several times, that you have this breakthrough, have this switch, your intuition will keep pushing harder and harder. You have to push it down harder and harder. It creates more and more tension. It becomes more and more strenuous. And sooner or later, there's going to be a breakdown. And it's going to be a big breakdown. The more tension there is, the bigger the breakdown. And the more violent the reaction is going to be. And you're going to be hugely disappointed. Maybe you're going to direct that disappointment at the guru or the organization or other people. But really, you're disappointed with yourself. Why did it take you this long to get this? So I'm just trying to say, if you can recognize these patterns and start looking at it just at least a little bit, you can make the switch that you wanted to make in your life plan before you go through this huge breakdown. And if I had known this, 47 years ago, my path would have been a lot easier. And there is no reason whatsoever that we should all repeat the same mistake, and we should all have to reinvent the wheel. So we can at least learn from each other. And so, it's this again, this lack of balance. And I've seen it in myself. I've seen it in other people. Take my second spiritual movement. Okay. This was a movement. It had teachings directly from the Ascended Masters. They were genuine, profound teachings. It had some genuine spiritual practices. But the organizational culture was deeply dysfunctional. And there were various reasons for this that I'm not going to go into. But the one thing I want to go into here is that the organizational culture was exceptionally judgmental. I mean, people were so judgmental of each other that I look back at it today and say, how could I even stand being there? I mean, it was ridiculous. And here's where it relates to balance, okay? Again, people thought, if you do all the outer things right, if you follow all the outer rules, then you'll make it on the path. And so, but in order to do all the outer things right, follow all the outer rules, there was so much you had to do that nobody could do it. But there were people who were really, really trying. I remember, the organization had a headquarters in the United States, in Montana. And there were 600 people working on staff. Some of them were children, but several hundred adults working on staff. And quite a number of these adults were single. And the single men usually had to work very hard because they were building roads and setting up mobile homes and all this stuff. But there were many of the women who worked in an office. So they weren't as physically exhausted after a day's work. And many of these single women, they would try to do everything right. They would do their work, then they would go to decrees, and you had these decree sessions that started at 5 o'clock in the morning. Then you would decree for 2.5 hours. You would eat breakfast, you would go to your work for 8 or 10 hours or whatever. Then they had decree sessions in the evening that could also last for 2.5 hours. And there were people who tried to do this. And then there was all these rules that you don't do this, you don't do that, you walk a certain way, talk a certain way, always be controlled, always be relaxed. And, you had to follow all these outer rules. You couldn't drive a red car, an orange car, or black car. You couldn't wear black clothes or red clothes. Of course, you couldn't take drugs or alcohol or this or that. Most people were vegetarians. And so all I'm trying to say with all of this is it was so hard to follow all the rules that in order to try to do it, people put themselves under this enormous strain. It was so hard, they were so tense, and you could see it in people's faces. People were just so tense. And as a result of that, of being always on the edge, they became very judgmental of those who are not following the rules as strictly as they were. You weren't doing this. You were doing that. You should have been doing this. Oh, he's not a real Chila. He's not really Chila material. And there was always this enormously judgmental culture. And all I'm trying to say with it, I'm not trying to blame anybody. Okay? I'm just saying this is the result of an imbalanced approach to spiritual growth. And I've seen it in other spiritual movements. They had a version of it in my first spiritual movement, but it wasn't quite as extreme. But it was clearly there. And I've seen it in other movements since then. I even saw it in Yogananda's organization, Self-Realization Fellowship, that I just visited very briefly, but it was enough that I could recognize the signs. And I believe it's there in many spiritual movements. And again, I'm not trying to blame anybody, right? If you have been exposed to this, you have seen this, then just realize it's the result of an imbalanced approach to spiritual growth. And where does it come from? It comes from a subconscious self you have that says, as I said, if I do this for you, God, you have to give me a higher state of consciousness. If I do these outer things, that does nothing to resolve my psychology, that ignores the need to resolve my psychology. But because I'm doing all this for you, God, and I'm doing this to help the planet, and I'm giving all of these decrees, and I'm meditating, you have to give me a higher state of consciousness. This is the problem. As I try to explain in my talk about gurus, you think the guru can do something for you. So you think that the guru can switch you into a higher state of consciousness without you having to look at your own psychology. That will never happen. It's just an illusion to think it can happen. And if somebody claims that it happened to them, I have to say that's because they haven't looked very deeply into their psychology. And they haven't seen what unresolved psychology they have left. They just covered it over by creating this giant subconscious self that's suppressing all of the other subconscious selves, and therefore projecting the image into their minds that they are living up to this, whatever ideal it is, awakened, enlightened, or whatever it is. There is no substitute for resolving psychology. That is the one conclusion I've come to after 47 years on the spiritual path. Trying all kinds of things, all kinds of compensation games. Trying to strike a bargain with God, the Ascended Masters, and the Great Pumpkin Man. It just doesn't work. There is no substitute for you looking right there. What is it I have to change? So, I'm talking about avoiding disappointment, right? So I realized that by talking about this, there are some people that might feel disappointed. You punctured my entire illusion about the spiritual path. But on the other hand, as long as you are upholding that illusion, there will come a point where you will feel disappointed. So I'm really just trying to prevent that bigger disappointment that's going to hit you at some point when you finally have that breakdown and you realize that it hasn't been working. And I know it's hard because I had to come to a point, I look back at myself and I look back at how I made all of this effort, I mean, I decreed for hours, hours every day. And I set aside a lot of other things in my life. Any kind of interest or hobby in my life was set aside so I could give all these decrees and go to all these decree services. And there just came a point where I had to realize, and this actually came to me, and I think must have been 2002, I think it was. And I realized that my entire approach to the spiritual path up to that point had been driven by this outer ambition, this human ambition. And I really had to face the question, does that mean it's all been for nothing? That it was all failed? That it didn't really have any effect? And that's why you have to be really, really careful. I met other people, of course, who have gone through the same. It's like you're staring down this abyss and you're feeling like you see that you had an unbalanced approach. And you're wondering, was it all for nothing? Was it all a failed approach? And that's why you have to be really, really careful, because it wasn't all for nothing. I look back at this and I see that absolutely in those 25 years where I took this more outer approach to the spiritual path, I did actually make progress. But it's just that the progress I made during that time wasn't because I did the outer things. It was because there were times where I looked at my psychology. I was in a way always looking at my psychology, because I've been doing that all of my life, even when I was a child. And I think many spiritual people have. It's just that there were certain things I wasn't willing to look at, I wasn't ready to look at. And so I did make progress. So I can look back and I could say, well, if I hadn't done what I did, I wouldn't have made the progress I made. And that's true. So that's why I'm saying, you don't need to flip from the one extreme, the one unbalance of thinking doing the outer things is automatically going to get you there, to the opposite extreme of saying it was all for naught then. You don't need to flip black and white like this. You can take a more balanced approach, middle way approach. So I can look back and I can say, okay, I had a clearly unbalanced approach to spirituality, but it still gave me some growth. However, I can also see, if I had found my balance point earlier, I would have made more progress. But again, I look back at it today without any regrets, because I realize given my psychology, couldn't have found the balance point earlier. Given my psychology. Now, if I had had a spiritual teacher who could have helped me see something in my psychology, I may have found it earlier. But given the situation as it was, I couldn't have done it earlier. And that's where, again, you have to step back, and instead of regretting this, instead of blaming yourself, you have to say, okay, why did I take this unbalanced approach? I look back today, right? And I look back at how I basically executed my spiritual path, you might say, in those 25 years. And I can see it was unbalanced, but I can also see that I had to do it. I had to do it that way. The thing is, what I realized today is, while I was doing it, I was thinking, oh, this is to get the result. This is to have the breakthrough. Because I will be in this higher state of consciousness. But now I realize that the reason I had to be so imbalanced, the reason I had to push so hard, was that I needed to come to this point where I had taken it to such an extreme that I just couldn't go any further. And therefore I became willing to look at it and say, is this really the balanced approach? Is it the optimum approach? So you see what I'm saying? It's like, given my psychology, given the subconscious cells that I had to push so hard. I had to be so extreme. But it wasn't to produce the result I was chasing. It was to come to see the imbalance. The imbalance compelled me to become more and more imbalanced until I could finally see the imbalance and decide to look at it and do something about it. And I've seen the same in many other spiritual people. And now, of course, this happened some years ago, so I've had many breakthroughs since then, and I've come a long way from this. So I don't feel the regret. I don't feel any regret. I don't feel I was wrong or I shouldn't have done this, because it was part of my path. But the thing is, if you're watching this video, do you have to take 25 years? Do you have to go into these extremes before you have the same switch and realize the need for balance? Now, one of the most inspiring stories I've heard on the spiritual path, and I've told it before, I know, is Gautama Buddha, who grew up in a palace, lived an entirely worldly lifestyle, focused on worldly pleasures, never saw an old person or a sick person. So he finally sees an old man one day. He realizes he's going to die like everybody else. And then he leaves the palace, leaves his wife, leaves his child, goes out into the forest, he finds a group of ascetics, and he sits there in a loincloth under a tree, letting his hair and beard grow so long that the birds make nests in his beard. And he almost starves to death, except a person walking by puts a single grain of rice in his mouth, and that gives him enough nourishment to survive. And he does this for 6 years. And all I'm saying is, this, I didn't do it exactly the same way, but this is what I did for 25 years, and I've seen many other spiritual people do the same thing. We grow up in this worldly culture, and we suddenly awaken to the spiritual path and think, I am going to give it my all on the spiritual path, so I'm going to go and do this, however you see it in your spiritual movement. Meditation courses, decrees, this or that. But what happened to the Buddha was, after having done this for 6 years, something happened in his mind where he realized he had just gone from one extreme to the other. And this wasn't the optimum way to have spiritual growth. So he discovered what he called the middle way. It's translated the middle way, which I think is unfortunate, because I think it was actually, as I've explained in several other videos, you have the two dualistic polarities, the worldly lifestyle, the ascetic lifestyle. But the middle way is not a compromise in between the two, it's transcending both polarities. So you find a balanced approach that isn't pulling you into these polarities. And so what do I mean with that? What do I mean with a balanced approach? Well, I hadn't really thought about this, but as I'm saying this, I'm realizing that I talked about I had a switch, where I switched from the deficit approach to the feeling that I was doing something positive, I was making progress. And what happened there was that I wasn't pulled in either direction anymore. I wasn't pulled back to the world, to go into the world and identify myself with the world. And I've seen spiritual people who pushed very hard for several years, and then they became disappointed, and then they had to go out and get into business or make money, or they became, focused on this, the worldly aspects of life. But I wasn't pulled in that direction, but neither was I wasn't compelled to do spiritual work, growth. It's almost like you could say that, you have, some people say you have two basic emotions in the world, love and fear. And when I was in the deficit approach, there was a certain fear in my approach to spirituality, because I was afraid I wasn't going to make it, I wasn't good enough, that I didn't live up to the demands and this and that I was going to fail my test. And so what happened is that when I overcame those separate selves that were compelling me to do this, I no longer have the compulsion. I stopped approaching the spiritual path with this sense of obsessive compulsion. In other words, I stopped having OCD, obsessive compulsion disorder, about spiritual growth. And from that moment on, it became just an enjoyable upward path. And this happened over 20 years ago, so I've gone through many, many stages, much growth, seen a lot of stuff in my psychology since then. But it's always been this sense of peace, sense of balance about it. You know, I'm not afraid I'm not going to make it. I sense that I am going to make it. And I am just steadily moving forward towards reaching as high a level of a consciousness as I can reach in this lifetime, and a high enough level that will allow me to ascend after this lifetime. I'm not afraid that I have to come back to Earth in another incarnation. So it's like this, what I'm trying to say is you switch from the obsessive compulsiveness, and that's really the imbalance. You know, when you have this obsessive compulsiveness, that's the sign of imbalance. So you switch out of that, and then you switch into an entirely positive, where, as I've said before, the spiritual path just becomes the greatest adventure you can experience on planet Earth. I mean, nothing else compares. There is no human activity today. And it's not that I live as a recluse and have completely closed myself off from human activities. There are certain human activities I participate in. But it's just, there is nothing that you could possibly come up with on Earth that could be more adventurous, more exciting, more fulfilling than the spiritual path. I don't care what you could think of. It would have no appeal to me beyond the spiritual path. It's not that I don't enjoy doing certain things in life, but it's just, compared to the spiritual path, you know, it will always take a second place. And so that's what I really wish that I could help you or inspire you to make that switch, to find your personal balance to the spiritual path. A personal balance between worldly activities and spiritual activities, so you're not driven by this obsessive compulsive disorder to do your spiritual activities. And you're not driven to forsake the worldly activities or look down on them, or as some people do, you know, you participate in the worldly activities you have to, but you're not enjoying it. You're definitely not enjoying it, because that's not spiritual. And so, you know, it's just, it's a much more enjoyable way to live when you find your personal balance. And I guarantee you, if you've been on a spiritual path for a while, it's not as far away as you think. But there is probably several things in your psychology that you need to look at and resolve before you find that balance. Perhaps you are down to where there's only one thing left. So there is one separate self that's hiding in the shadows, and it's probably hiding behind your image of what it means to be a good spiritual student, what it means to follow the spiritual path. So if you are willing, you know, examine your image. What has driven you up to this point? What is defined in your spiritual movement, your spiritual teaching, for what it means to be a good student and to really be walking the path? And it can be anything, you know. So I said in my first spiritual movement, they had a, you know, you're meditating, you're striving to take all these courses. If you're a man, you're wearing a suit and tie. You're always speaking softly and always in control of your emotions. And in my second spiritual movement, there was even more elaborate, you know, what you were supposed to do. And in my second spiritual movement, you know, what helped me find a little balance there was that I came to a point where I actually, my mind just stepped back and I looked at all of these demands. If I had to do all of the demands, I couldn't do it in 24 hours. I literally couldn't do it in 24 hours if I also had to sleep. I couldn't do it. And so I simply said, well, I can't do everything. So I have to do what I can do in the long run instead of the crash and burn, you know. I have to do what's sustainable for me, given the outer situation and the demands on me. And so if you can come to see that, what is it in your culture that's putting this demand on you for what it means to be a spiritual student, and maybe question that a little bit, you can probably make some progress and perhaps even make that switch where you find a balance. And that's all I really hope for you. I'm not trying to tell you that you should be a certain way on a spiritual path, that you should do what I have done. You need to find your own personal balance. Balance being the operative word.